What's up? My name is Casey Budge. This is the Fake Crime Podcast. And today we have an awesome episode for you. It is the start of the Marvel Cinematic Universe villains. So, the Marvel Cinematic Universe was this big experiment that's still ongoing, but it was kind of to give the experience of comics where different characters would show up in different stories and they were all interconnected and building towards a greater story always all together, and that was kind of the idea, was to bring that to the big screen. And so Iron Man was technically the first one of those. Technically it was the Incredible Hulk, but the Incredible Hulk wasn't good and also was wrong and did a lot of other things. It's a whole long story. Basically, there was an actor who was in it and he wanted more money to come back in the later movies, so they recast him but kept the rest of the story the same. So I'm just not going to bother talking about that one because it isn't really that important for this. We're going to talk about these in release order. So we're going to do Iron Man first, and then I think it's Captain America is second, and then Thor, and then it goes into Avengers. But yeah, that's kind of the thought there. So the first villain that we're going to talk about is the main antagonist from the first Iron Man movie, and that is Obadiah Stane, a Iron Monger. So Obadiah Stane was a businessman who worked at, well, actually, let's start off by talking about what Stark Industries is. So Stark Industries was founded by Howard Stark, and it initially did all sorts of things. It had all sorts of ventures and projects and stuff like that. But its main kind of purpose was as a arms dealer to the United States military during World War II. And he was a big proponent of SHIELD, which we don't really find out about until later, but he was kind of a big instigating factor in this covert intelligence agency within the United States armed forces, and he helped supply weapons, and he was a big part of the war effort during World War II. So later on in his career, he had a business partner named Obadiah Stane and Anton Vanko, and that becomes important later. But Obadiah Stane was kind of his younger man who was kind of his business partner up until uh, up until 1967, when Vanko, who was part of Stark Enterprises at the time too, was deported and found guilty of espionage and all of that. So then it was just Obadiah Stane and Howard Stark. And on December 6, 1991, Howard Stark and his wife Maria were killed in a car accident, or so we think. And Stane was extremely sad about this, but he at this time took over as interim CEO of Stark Industries. And at the time, Howard Stark had a son named Tony Stark, and he was quite a bit younger, but he was already a brilliant mind. He was a genius, a certifiable genius, and he attended MIT, and he was doing all these incredible things, but he was a little lazy, and he was obviously this kind of narcissistic son of this brilliant man who had done his best to help the war effort and everything. So he was obviously struggling with the reputation of his father, and he had these heavy shoes to step into. And so the board wisely left Obadiah Stane as the CEO until Tony Stark, the protagonist of the story, was a little bit older, and he was able to step in and fill in the shoes of his father. And at the time, main product of Stark Industries is still weapons. So they're still manufacturing all sorts of weapons, including new missiles, new defense systems. They also do all sorts of other things. They manufacture other war supplies as well. So it's kind of this big company that is all profiting off of war. But to Tony's knowledge, they're only supplying the U.S. So they're, in his mind, helping to keep the peace in the world, because the United States in our world, as well as in the world of the MCU, is kind of seen as this peacekeeper state. So our task is, in a lot of cases, to keep peace between smaller nations and that sort of thing.
Keep peace and protect democracy.
Exactly. And that's kind of been the case throughout history, especially in World War II. That was kind of our whole goal in both world wars, really, was to keep peace and protect democracy. So through his actions, Tony believes that he is doing that, and that he is helping to arm the United States and to protect the lives of young members of the armed forces by supplying the United States with better weapons than their enemies have. Because if you have the bigger stick, then the other guys aren't going to want to hit you. I mean that's the bottom line of it, is that if you have the bigger toys, then it's a lot easier to fight and a lot less lives will be lost doing that. So his kind of view is this deterrence is kind of the best answer. So when Tony was put in charge of the company at this time, Obadiah Stane stayed on as kind of the number two, and he helped to transition Tony into his new role as the CEO. But he began feeling resentful, as anyone would. He was in charge. He was there when Howard Stark built the company from the ground up. He has been there since the beginning. So he felt resentful about this whole thing, about Tony getting put in charge and everything like that. So he, on the side, starts selling Stark Industry weapons to like smaller factions, including but not limited to the Ten Rings, which is this small mercenary organization, and they hold this power in this small Middle Eastern country. They're these terrorists who are constantly fighting and warring, and their motivations, at least in the movies, are kind of unclear. There's this whole bigger story in the comics that I could go into, but in the movies, for the very least, for the most part, it doesn't really go into what their motivations are, besides like keeping control of this region and that sort of thing. So they're this extremist kind of group. They're kind of seen as this group from everywhere that is kind of has these extreme ideals. And Obadiah Stane starts selling the U.S.'s weapons and Stark Industries weapons to this small group. And so that's naturally kind of a betrayal, but he's smart. He's been there for a long time, so he is able to cover up his tracks. And he does this for a while, but at some point he decides, you know what, that's not enough. I want to have control of this company back for myself. I want this company to myself. So he organizes an operation with the Ten Rings that he is going to have Tony Stark go and present a new weapon, the Jericho missile, to the armed forces in Afghanistan. So somewhere that the Ten Rings could theoretically reach Tony and attack him. And when Tony is over there, the Ten Rings are going to attack him. But Obadiah Stane also did something tricky, which is that they didn't tell him. He didn't tell the Ten Rings that Tony Stark was the target. He just told them, yeah, there's this guy who's going to be with this group. I need you to kill him. And so Tony goes over there. He presents the Jericho missile. It is this extraordinarily powerful weapon. It's not a nuclear weapon, but it is this weapon that like creates a massive amount of destruction with just one projectile shot off, and it's crazy. It's in the movie, it's such a cool scene that they shot too. Fun fact about the movie is that when they were shooting it, and there's this big explosion back behind Tony Stark, and it like knocks him off his feet. That wasn't in the script. That was just like the pyrotechnics went off behind Robert Downey Jr. and knocked him off his feet, and he kind of fell forward. So that's kind of a fun fact about that.
Yeah, right. It literally knocks the socks off of the people who are watching this demonstration. Yeah,
exactly. It's super cool. So Tony is on his way back to the airport, and Obadiah Stane calls him, and he asks him, how'd it go? Like, where are you guys? Are you on your way back? And Tony's like, yep, it went really well. we're here, yada, yada, yada. And then shortly after he hangs up, the Ten Rings attacks their convoy because he's traveling with the army or the armed forces or whatever it is, and they attack them, and Tony is not killed. However, he is captured, but most of the convoy that he was with is killed because the Ten Rings is using Stark technologies. And Tony actually discovers this when he is in the middle of the fighting, is that when a missile lands right next to him, he sees on the side of it that it is a Stark Industries missile.
How
And so
awful would that be to be like overseas and all of a sudden the technology that you thought only the good guys had, is being used against you to capture you? That'd be horrible.
seriously, that would be such a crazy, crazy deal because you have built all this technology and you've spent all of your time and your energy designing these specific weapons to make sure there's peace in the world, that there is this protection from this exact kind of thing, and that exact technology is what's used against you. And this is why this movie is so good, is because like it didn't have to be this good. It didn't have to be an examination of power itself. It didn't have to be a cool examination of the, like, it didn't have to be a cool metaphor for the nuclear arms race. It just had to be a silly comic book movie. But they made it into so much more just because of a couple of things. The Robert Downey Jr. is an incredible actor. The director and like Kevin Feige and everyone did such an incredible job like laying this out and formatting it. And I don't know if Kevin Feige was on board at this time, but we'll get into Kevin Feige. Don't you worry. All right. So Tony Stark at this point is captured by the Ten Rings, and he is taken to their camp, and they tell him, okay, we want you to build us a Jericho missile. We saw that and they show him the intelligence photos that they have of the Jericho missile, and they're like, yeah, we want one of those for our own use. And so he's like, no, I'm not gonna build that. So they torture him, they like waterboard him, they do all this incredibly inhumane stuff to him, and he is like beaten and all sorts of stuff. And finally, they get through to him by threatening to kill his like assistant type guy. And his name is Jensen, and he talks about having a family and all this stuff. So that's kind of the whole thing. So Tony starts working on things, but instead of building the Jericho missile like they want him to, he builds this suit of armor. He takes like, well, first of all, let me back up 2 steps. So during the attack, Tony was hit with shrapnel, and it is in his bloodstream, and it is flowing towards his heart. And so if the shrapnel gets into his heart, it will kill him. So the Jensen, the guy who is with him, has attached an electromagnet to his chest, and the electromagnet is keeping the shrapnel away from his heart, and it's pulling it away. So Tony is like essentially hooked up to a car battery when he first wakes up, and so there's this kind of crazy stuff going on. And so Tony, first off, go ahead.
And during this scene, they are living in this like cave in the Middle East, like crazy thing where they are in the Middle East in this dark little cave, and it's scary for sure.
Yeah, and oh man, it's just wild how like Jensen must have done surgery on Tony, like in these conditions, how Tony doesn't die of sepsis through this, like
Sepsis doesn't exist when you're a superhero.
When you're a
talking
superhero,
about?
sepsis doesn't exist. Yeah, or cholera, or
Yeah. I mean, no superhero has died of sepsis. So
that's what I want to see is
I do too. That's
like he
Marvel. Here's your next one.
is this guy goes through all these crazy battles and then he dies because he doesn't properly disinfect a cut on his arm before taking a bullet out of his arm. That's the movie I want to see. So anyway, Tony first off is like, okay, well, first off, I can't drag this car battery around with me all the time. So I need to make a portable power source for myself. So he's like, my dad built this cool thing called an arc reactor. And it's this huge power source. I bet if I got some plutonium out of these missiles, I can make myself a little one of these. So he does. He gets the plutonium out, he melts it down, he makes a ring out of it, and he makes himself a little arc reactor from this plutonium. And he sticks it in his chest, and it acts as both the battery and the reactor. So then he is able to get up and move around more freely. And it also has the added benefit of looking super cool. It looks super sick.
Wicked. Yeah.
So he's just walking around with this glowing ball on his chest all the time. And so he, at that point, goes about making himself a iron suit, a suit that will allow him to escape this place, and not only that, but not get shot or anything like that on the way out. So he builds this whole suit. It has flamethrowers and stuff on it. It has the ability to fly very slowly and very poorly through a series of events. Tony is able to escape. Him and Jensen plan this whole thing, but in the escape, Jensen sacrifices himself for Tony, and he reveals that his family has been dead the whole time, that they were killed by the Ten Rings when they took his village. And when Jensen was talking about going home to his village, he was talking about dying. So he was kind of alluding to that the whole time. There's also the most iconic scene in all of Marvel, I think, in this part, and it's where Tony is like clanking on the parts, and like the sparks are flying. That's such a cool scene. I love that so much, and the sound effect is just iconic. So Tony is able to escape from the Ten Rings, and he is quickly scooped up by the U.S. Armed Forces and taken back to the U.S. And Obadiah Stane, in the meantime, has been talking to the Ten Rings, and they have told him, "You didn't tell us that this was Tony Stark who we were paid to kill. You told us that this was just some guy, so we want more money if you want us to kill him." And so he doesn't agree to do that. He doesn't agree to pay them more money, so that's why they wanted him to make the Jericho missile, is because they wanted more stuff from him. So they were trying to recoup that kind of loss, and so they ended up getting that, but again, he escaped. So Stane is kind of like, okay, well, what am I going to do now? So he goes and he meets with Tony, and this, in my opinion, is kind of an attempt to make sure, okay, what does Tony know? What has he learned? And Tony isn't immediately pissed with him, so he's like, okay, I'm in the clear for now. So Tony immediately is like, okay, I want to call a press conference. And so he calls a press conference, and he's like, hey, I saw my weapons used to kill members of the U.S. military, and I can't do that, and I won't have my company be held accountable for that. So until we can reach that level of accountability, Stark Industries is not manufacturing weapons anymore. So everyone goes crazy because that's most of what Stark Industries does, is manufacture weapons. So
this multi-billion-dollar company is now not going to be producing hardly anything.
Yeah. So everyone freaks out. Obadiah Stane freaks out. So they all kind of have this big freak out. Well, at this point, Obadiah Stane kind of starts working behind the scenes, and he starts talking to the board and stuff. But Tony goes back and he starts working on a new and improved arc reactor for his chest, because the one that he originally made was just made out of scraps and it wasn't quite good enough. So he starts making a new one. And at that point, Obadiah also kind of figures out, oh, like, hey, what's going on with your chest? And he sees the mini arc reactor that Tony has too. So he's like, wow, that's really cool. And Tony's like, yeah, this is kind of my idea, is why don't we look more into this instead of doing like weapons? And Obadiah's like, that was a publicity stunt. We couldn't really do that. Like, that's not a real sustainable deal. So they kind of part ways and are disagreeing about that. Well, Obadiah then has a meeting with the board members in New York, and they all agree to cut Tony off as the CEO of Stark Industries. So they vote him out and they freeze his voting power. So he's effectively cut off, but Obadiah doesn't tell Tony this until a little bit later. So he is kind of meeting with Tony and talking to Tony and trying to convince him that, but he has this back plan that he is trying to get them to start selling weapons again and doing that sort of thing because he's missing his inflow of cash and that sort of thing. But in the meantime, Tony invents not only the new chess piece, the new arc reactor, but he also invents the Mark II, his new and improved Iron Man suit. And it's sweet. That scene is also amazing. And the thing that I really like about that is that it feels super like grounded. Like it feels like this is something that like a super genius could do. It doesn't feel that far off of reality. Like it obviously is, but it's not like super science fiction like a thousand years ago.
It's not like when a crazy spider bites you and all of a sudden you can shoot webs out of your hands.
Yeah, it's
that you're no longer are we talking about a superhero who has had some sort of magic happen.
Yeah,
He's
it's
from
science in theory.
He is a regular human being, except for he's a super genius. But
yeah, he's a very smart human being. Yeah. So he goes on and does that, and in the meantime, they freeze Tony out of the company. Obadiah starts selling weapons back to the Ten Rings, and in the meantime, Tony sees on the news that the Ten Rings has once again attacked a small village with Stark weapons again. So Tony gets pissed. He flies over there, and he, after confronting Obadiah at a ball, there's a whole ball gala scene in there in the middle, but that's not as important. Tony flies over there, blows up a bunch of their stuff, but is also seen by news cameras and stuff. And so Obadiah then learns about the Iron Man suit. Tony also accidentally destroys a plane in the meantime. Poor Rhodey has to deal with that. He has to tell everyone that there was a training exercise going on. And so Obadiah starts getting really curious about what Tony's doing. And so he like starts peeking and prodding around, but Tony keeps it pretty close to the chest. So Obadiah's like, well, damn, I need a new plan. So he's like, okay, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the 10 Rings and I'm going to get Tony's original suit. I'm going to piece it back together and I'm going to bring it back here and I'm going to build it myself. I'm going to build one myself so that I can compete with Tony. So he does that. He has the 10 Rings gather up all the pieces that they can find from it, and he goes over there. And in the meantime, they are like trying to bargain with him about the price of it, and they're like, "Oh yeah, you're gonna make us more of these, right? Like these are awesome. These are the coolest things we've ever seen." And Obadiah is like, yeah, cool. And then he pulls out this portable paralyzer, or the sonic paralyzer thing, paralyzes the leader of the 10 Rings, and kills him and all of his men. So Obadiah Stane takes the Iron Monger suit back to the U.S. and has eliminated the 10 Rings, basically. So now he is the primary and only threat going forward. And in the meantime, he's been having the scientists at Stark Industries try and duplicate the arc reactor and create a mini one because he needs a power source for his suit. And he's like, okay, I need something small that will fit into this suit because that's kind of the main constraint on it is that you need something that can power this suit that's amazingly powerful but also portable. And that just doesn't exist. So he's looking for it, and they just can't do it. And at one point they're talking about it and he's like, Tony Stark built this in a cave with a bunch of scraps. And that's by far one of the best lines in the movies.
Right. And then like,
and the next line
technology just doesn't exist. We can't do it. And he's like, broski.
Yeah. And he's like, I'm sorry, I'm not Tony Stark. Which is hilarious. Which is hilarious because No one is Tony Stark.
No one is.
He's one of one. So Obadiah is like, man, well, I need to think of something else. Well, in the meantime, Pepper Potts, Tony's assistant, is caught sneaking into Obadiah's computers, and she finds a bunch of incriminating evidence on him. She finds video messages from the Ten Rings talking about where they want more money from Obadiah. They talk about him trying to get Tony assassinated. All these things. She finds all this incriminating evidence, and so Obadiah knows that, oh man, I need to do something fast because the cops are probably going to be coming to get me any time now. So he's like, oh, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to just go and rip the power source right out of Tony's chest and go on a rampage in my new Iron Monger suit. So he does. He takes his sonic paralyzer over to Tony's house, acts like a friend, turns it on by him, takes the new chest piece out of Tony himself, which is causing him to die basically because the shrapnel is moving towards his heart, and so that's not good. And so he basically leaves Tony for dead, and he takes the new piece and he puts it in his chest, and he does kind of go on a little mini rampage in his Iron Monger suit, which is this huge honking piece of machinery which juxtaposes, that's a hard word, with Tony's like sleek, slim design for his suit.
Yeah.
And so Tony eventually is able to crawl down and get the old chest piece, which was outdated. He puts it back in himself and gets in his new suit. Well, the problem with that is that the old chest piece was never designed to power the new suit. It doesn't have near as much power. It was literally built in a cave with a bunch of scraps. So he is at a severe disadvantage, but he goes to fight Obadiah. And they have this huge battle, and in which the funniest line is said. Obadiah's like, he's about to take off in his big clunky suit, and he's like, my suit is more advanced than yours in every way. And it takes him like 12 seconds to launch off the ground. It's honestly hilarious, whereas Tony like flies off the ground. And then Tony exploits a thing that he found out earlier, which is an icing problem when you enter the upper atmosphere. So Tony combated that using paint that is used on satellites, and so that was easily combated for Tony. But since Obadiah hadn't really tested his at all, he didn't know about that.
Right.
So Tony kicks Obadiah's butt with the help of Pepper, and they also end up destroying the big arc reactor in order to kill Obadiah. So he is dead at the end of the story. And Tony publicly declares himself Iron. So the story is a lot of things. It's about power and the responsibility to use power when you have it, but also the need to be accountable for how your power is used. It is also about subverting the normal tropes of being a hero. So Tony Stark is narcissistic. He is egocentric. He is a billionaire. He's a playboy. He's all these things, and he does not fit your typical hero mold. But he is a hero because he does, in the end, choose to protect people. Even if it's egocentric and even if it's for his own reasons, he decides to protect people. And that is what makes him a hero. I mean, that's just as cut and dry as it gets. And Obadiah is not. He was always self-serving. He was always looking out for himself. He was willing to hurt people. He was willing to kill people. He was willing to kill his best friend's kid just because he was vain and jealous of him. He wasn't my favorite villain of the Marvel villains. He's kind of one of those like one-dimensional sort of villains that is not the best, but next week's is going to be the best because we get to talk about more Starks. We get to talk about Norse mythology. We get to talk about Nazis. We get to talk about fake science. We got to talk about America. We get to talk about the military some more. We get to talk about Captain America and his primary antagonist, Red Skull.
Heck
Heck yeah.
yeah. It's gonna be.
Well, yeah. Anything you want to shout out before we end the
I think
episode, Kate?
that I like when I think of Iron Man, I think of this scene where he's in his workshop and it's time to change out his reactor heart
Yeah.
magnet thing. And he has his assistant come down and he's like, "Be very careful because you could kill me very easily right here." And has her like reach down into his chest cavity and connect the new reactor, and it's gross, and she accidentally shocks him, and it's just a funny scene for sure.
It is a funny scene, but also one of the things that I really like about that scene is that it is also speaking to something else in Tony in that he doesn't have any friends. Like, he doesn't have buddies who he hangs out with. He is alone. He is all that he has. He's an eccentric billionaire who only has his closest friend is his AI that he created for himself and his work assistant. And maybe like the Captain Rhodey, who's this Air Force pilot, but besides that.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Well, that was a fun episode, Kate. Thanks for
All right.
recording with me.
Thanks for sticking it out with me.
No problem. Be sure to follow us on Instagram. Be sure to like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. Be sure to leave us a rating if you're listening anywhere else and follow us wherever you listen. Thank you so much for listening. We're going to try and truck through the whole of the MCU kind of in one go. We might do some interim episodes in here if Kate finds any things that she wants to talk about, but for now we're just going to be going right along. And that is all from us. Thanks, guys.